Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Petrik, and I'm the Shoreland's program manager, or the DNR's statewide Shoreland program manager, and welcome to Shoreland Higher Standards. Today's session is really designed to be a showcase of some of the higher standards that local governments across the state have done, and maybe be an idea generator for you and your community. Opportunities for improving policy to protect shoreland areas are endless, and so we're hoping to cover some of those today. Just an FYI, we are recording this session, and eventually we will have it transcribed for closed captioning and placed on our website. So if you want to share this with others or look at some parts of it in the future, that will be possible. So with me today is also Matt Bauman, who will be monitoring the chat with me and responding to some of your questions. But if you want to have an online discussion too, you can certainly unmic yourself or unmute yourself and ask a question that way too. With that, why don't we start? And today we're going to briefly discuss what and why we have higher standards. And then we're going to spend most of our time going through different types of higher standard examples that local governments across the state have adopted. For those of you who have seen this before, we've added some new ideas since last year, but there is a lot of the same things that we've talked about in previous sessions. I also want to point out that, and I'm putting in our link right now, or I'm in the chat box, that is, a link to our higher standards webpage. And many of the standards that we'll be talking about today are covered on this webpage, including links, or not links, but citations to the policy or regulation in the various local governments that have adopted these standards. So after the session, please take a look at that or bookmark that and come back to it when you have a chance to think about some of these ideas more thoroughly. So first of all, what are higher standards? These, frankly, are any standards that exceed the minimum state shoreline standards, and they're voluntary, and they most likely address very specific local concerns. The shoreline standards are a statewide kind of one-size-fits-all regulatory package. And over time, a lot of local governments have decided they need to sort of design a set of standards that really address their particular shoreland issues. And many communities also adopt higher standards because the shoreland rules are old. They are insufficient to address many of today's problems. And for those of you new to this area, the shoreline standards were last updated in 1989, and were frankly designed for a very different climate and development era. And kind of like the cars we drive, the world of shoreland development has changed a lot since then. And demand for shoreline property, for example, has intensified. Homes are much larger. Natural shorelines, along with their habitat and water filtration benefits, are continually being replaced with suburban style landscaping. So let's look at a few reasons why communities are considering and adopting higher standards. First, with more intense rainfall events and flashy rivers that move, some communities have limited development in risky areas or increased structure setbacks to protect property and to protect property values and tax base. Also, with loss of riparian vegetation, more intense rain events, and suburban style landscaping, more nutrients are flowing into lakes and rivers, increasing algae growth. And to combat this, some communities are limiting land alterations along shorelines and requiring restoration to protect water quality and the recreational value of lakes and rivers. And keeping in mind that warming waters increase the rate of algae growth, in Minnesota, compared to 50 years ago, the average summer water temperature in Minnesota lakes are anywhere from 3 to 4 degrees warmer. This graph here shows is data, a graph from the PCA's water surface website. And the three lines here represent the warming trend for lakes in northern, southern, and in the central part of the state. The bottom line, the light blue line, represents northern Minnesota lakes, and you can see the trend there is growing at a faster rate. The green line is for lakes in the central part of the state, and the dark blue line is southern states. But, we can't do anything about warming waters, but we can do something about limiting the nutrients that flow into our waters through higher standards that limit alterations along the shore and require shoreline buffers. It's important to keep in mind that our lakes really are getting warmer, even though some people may not be aware of that. But after this warm winter, hopefully it's really top of mind. And maybe this is a really good time to start talking about prospective algae growth and things the community can do to sort of slow down the growth of algae. And then lastly, a lot of communities are just noticing the loss of shoreline vegetation and the loss of habitat for some of our more iconic species in the state. And so, again, there's a desire to protect this vegetation and protect, the species that we expect to see when we go up to the lake, or anywhere we go to recreate in waters in the Minnesota, and vegetation is a key part of that. So let's move on a bit and start thinking about what higher standards are and how we might implement them. There are several important considerations for you to think about. And so there's, all communities are a little different, but there are some categories of characteristics you can think about. First of all, if you're a community that's still developing, frankly, you have more opportunities to change how future development looks on a larger scale. If you're already developed, you're more limited to influencing infill development or redevelopment. Do you have many non-conforming lots and structures? If so, you'll need to design standards that function on smaller lots. And lastly, you need to think about the administrative capacity and political will to administer some of these standards. Some standards may require more staff time to explain and to administer or follow up on. And lastly, is there enough community support or political will to adopt them? And a lot of times, as you know, this requires a sales process where you need to talk about these things for a while, have maybe some community meetings or planning commission meetings to think about some of these ideas before the community is willing to go forward. And through that process, you get a lot of community input and ideas on how you might modify some of these ideas to suit your particular community. So in many cases across the state, these higher standards just didn't happen overnight. They were the result of a concerted effort by staff and maybe some elected officials or community members who really pushed some of these ideas. But before we start looking at some of these higher standards, I want you to keep in mind that your shoreline zoning district can be thought of as many sub-districts. The types of shoreland issues may have could possibly exist uniformly in all shoreland areas, or they may only be present around certain lakes or rivers. And if that's the case, you can certainly target these higher standards to only those lakes or rivers that need the attention or the change in policy. So, it's not a one-size-fits-all in your community. You can certainly be very customized in how you design some of these things. Okay, well, let's start looking at some higher standards. Let's start with a group of land use ideas. And the first and really most straightforward one here is to think about the land uses that you allow in shoreland. This graphic here shows hypothetically how you might change some standards from the minimum standards in the shoreland rules. For example, under the multifamily category, we're really referring here to duplex, triplex, or quad type homes. And the shoreland rules allow those as permitted uses in around both general development and recreational development lakes, and a conditional use around a natural environment lake. In this case here, the idea is that you make those types of more dense housing options conditional use around recreational lakes and not permitted at all around natural environment lakes. And so that's just the idea in this chart. WOAS stands for water-oriented accessory structures. I think the rest of these hopefully are pretty self-explanatory. But this is certainly one way to think about some higher standards, and just as limiting or requiring certain uses be reviewed and approved as a conditional use. Another idea under the use category is to prohibit water-oriented accessory uses. This photo isn't actually a water-oriented accessory structure. It's too big for one, but it's a great photo. You can see how these sort of structures can really affect the landscape and take away the opportunity for natural vegetation. You can prohibit these, or in some cases, some communities have moved them backwards. The Shoreland rules allow such structures if they're 10 feet from the shore and they're intended for storing boating equipment or, life jackets and things like that. But, some communities don't allow them at all, or some communities require them to be set back even further than 10 feet. So this is one option in the land use category. Another option is to prohibit the use of controlled access lots and easements. Controlled access lots are another provision in the Shoreland rules where that are created at the time of subdivision, where you can create a lot, and that lot comes with 6 mooring spaces, and you can make that bigger with just an expansion of the lot width. But the idea is to give access to non-riparian homeowners in a subdivision to a lake. And for a lot of communities, this is something that is adding more crowding or boat traffic to a lake that's already busy. And so the idea is to prohibit these controlled access lots, or to limit how many boats can be added to them. Related to this is the prohibition on access easements. The Shoreland rules actually only address water access through the controlled access lot provisions, and they're actually silent on access easements. And this is a case where a riparian property owner creates a recorded easement for someone else to access the water. And unless local governments have set up procedures to track this, these easements operate in the dark a little bit. Many communities aren't really aware of them and only become aware of it during a permit for expansion or some other reason to look closely at a property. And so some communities have decided just to prohibit these or to only allow them through a conditional use permit. Again, here the idea is to limit lake crowding, to reduce nuisance complaints or feuds with neighbors, or for other reasons. And so, this is just an example of something that isn't commonly considered until somebody complains about, people parking on a lot or noise from someone who's not the neighbor who's using a dock for boating access. All right, let's move on to another group of higher standards, dimensional standards, things like lot size and setbacks. So one of the most common higher standards is simply to increase lot size. And this is something that's very easy to do for a growing community. This isn't really something that's available for a fully developed community. But it is one way certainly to address and protect lake water quality by reducing density. You're most likely going to have an indirect effect of protecting more shoreline vegetation and rural character. Most undeveloped lakes in undeveloped communities or developing communities are natural environment lakes. These are oftentimes, they look more like wetlands, but they're very, very sensitive to development and runoff. And so increasing the lot size on these sorts of lakes is especially valuable for protecting these lakes from nutrient pollution and, eutrophication or, aging of the water body. A related idea here is the putting in a minimum buildable area. And this is especially important for development around natural environment lakes. So this concept makes sure that there is enough area after accounting for all the setbacks, from bluffs or from the water, right of way, drainage easements, bad soils such as boggy, wet soils, to make sure that there's still enough upland dry area to actually develop. You could have a lot that meets the minimum lot size, but because of site conditions like these, there's not enough area to build unless you get a variance from one of the standards. And so the idea is to make sure you don't end up doing that by but through a process of having a minimal buildable area. And so this is a very helpful idea, especially around natural environment lakes. As you can see, a number of counties have done this. Crow Wing and Hubbard, Itasca and Cass County all have minimum buildable areas. And so if you are interested in learning more about these, you can look at our website and find the citations in their ordinances to see what they specifically have done. Another very straightforward and popular higher standard, again, especially in developing communities, is to increase the setback from the water. This higher standard also pairs well with the larger lot size standard that we just discussed. Greater setbacks minimize impacts to the nearshore area, helps to preserve lakeshore character. And some of our most important and valuable plants and animals live in the nearshore area. So this also, helps to protect them and accommodates for more suitable building locations as well. Again, greater setbacks that reduces impacts to flooding risk and eroding shorelines or ice ridges. So a lot of positives for increasing setbacks as well. And again, this is something that's a good idea or more practical for a developing community. Septic setbacks in Minnesota didn't exist until the shoreline rules were implemented by the state. And, over time, we've learned that septic systems basically are the largest contributor of nutrients to lakes. And they can in themselves cause a lot of algae growth, especially in areas with failing systems. While soil influences how much nutrients are filtered out, so does distance from the water. And studies have shown that drain fields that are set further back from the water contribute fewer nutrients to that water. And so again, there's a real strong connection here between water quality and setback. And so a number of communities have increased the setback from the water. This is also fairly common. Bluff setbacks, however, are not even regulated by the shoreline standards, but some communities have decided that that's an important issue, and they do require setbacks from the top of bluff. LeSueur County, for example, and Itasca County doesn't even allow them in the bluff impact zone. Of course, there can be problems with saturating soils in a bluff area, or depending on your geology, you could have leakage through a bluff wall. And so there's a variety of reasons that you might want to consider this. And in this case, you'd probably want to understand what the geology is in your area, what kind of soil conditions you have around bluff areas. So something useful to think about there. And then bluff setbacks is a big deal, especially in the era of more intense rains and eroding or failing bluffs and steep slopes. Increasing setbacks is very valuable. It also has the positive benefit of reducing visual impact from shoreline areas or out in the lake or a river. This sort of thing is especially important in the lower St. Croix, where visual quality is so important. So again, bluff setbacks, and in the Mississippi River critical area, a fairly recently adopted rule program in the Twin Cities area along the Mississippi. Setbacks range from 40 to 100 feet, depending on the district that you're in. And here the main idea is to protect the visual quality of the river corridor, especially in the more rural areas of the Mississippi. So let's move on to another category designed around water body classifications. Recall that water body classifications are the method by which dimensional standards such as lot area and width and setback standards are applied. So we have for lakes 3 categories: natural environment lakes, which are the most sensitive to development and have the strictest standards, and general development lakes on the other end of the spectrum are the deepest lakes, least sensitive to development, and have the less strict development standards. Recreational development lakes are in the middle, and there is a similar range of classifications, but different for rivers. So that's the framework in which we're talking about now. So within that classification framework, some communities have applied classifications to water bodies smaller than 25 acres or 10 acres if you're a city. And so, for example, St. Louis County assigned a shoreline classification to nearly every basin. and they have a lot of basins smaller than 25 acres. Most of those turn out to be natural environment. And so this is one way to just sort of provide blanket protection to and uniform treatment to all waters within your community. Some other communities such as Murray, Roseau, and Polk have assigned North natural environment classifications to all those without one. The DNR has had classification criteria, and in some cases, communities have decided to have different criteria in terms of the sizing. And so in these cases, they've also assigned a natural environment classification to many water bodies that the DNR hasn't. Another approach is to adopt classification stricter than the DNR classification. In this case, Todd County reclassified all rivers to a natural environment lake classification instead of using a river classification. And Itasca adopted a natural environment lake standards for all lakes that we classify as recreational development. So again, it's a way to sort of uniformly approach this and provide consistency across a jurisdiction. This works well for counties, cover a lot of land area, and it's just one way of treating all similarly classified water bodies the same. A slightly different approach is to designate waters for special protection based on a study. And in this case, Beltrami County has done a very nice job. They've created 2 new classifications based on thorough studies of their water resources and specific concerns they've identified in their community. And in this case, they looked at 2 categories. One, they label special protection. These are lakes that are particularly vulnerable to phosphorus pollution. And those lakes also pair up nicely with the DNR data on lakes of phosphorus sensitivity. That's the lower picture shown here. It's a GIS layer available from the DNR. Beltrami County also created another category called sensitive area. These are shorelines that are sensitive to flooding or steep slope erosion, poor soil conditions, wetlands, or other physical constraints. And so they have 2 categories like this based on very thorough studies. The DNR has data for both phosphorus sensitivity and another category called lakes of biological sensitivity or significance. If this sort of thing interests you and you live in a rural area and are concerned about growing development, then you might look at these sort of resources to help inform a study or a review of maybe standards that are more appropriate. This is just a quick look at how Beltrami County applied dimensional standards commensurate with their new classified water bodies. And you can see in red that the standard is significantly higher in most of these categories than the minimum standard in the rules. So clearly here what they're trying to do is really reduce density of development on these 2 new categories of lakes, especially on the special protection category. Communities that are feeling pressure to develop, this might be one way of really trying to minimize the impacts from a lot of new development along your lake shores. Okay, moving on to land alteration and impervious surface. There's a lot of new ideas here. One is the idea of not allowing excavations in a bluff impact zone for walkout homes. So, the shoreline rules don't allow structures in the bluff impact zone, but grading and tree removal is allowed in the bluff impact zone if it's part of permitted work such as a house. And, houses that meet a 30-foot setback may need to be graded into the bluff impact zone, but a walkout structure certainly would be, just because of the way these homes are designed and the need for grading to open up the lower level. And so Douglas and Beltrami counties prohibit excavations in the bluff impact zone for walkouts, which has a nice benefit of protecting trees and vegetation at the top end of steep slopes or bluffs. They also minimize impacts from these sorts of developments because these types of homes really do have a major impact on the topography and the vegetation to site them and grade for them. Another very common standard is to reduce impervious surface coverage Many counties have done that, and some cities, and some communities have just chosen to do this based on the lake classification. Again, after septic systems, runoff from impervious surface is the next largest contributor of nutrients to our lakes and rivers. And so this is a big area to help with that idea. Again, this is a little more challenging for developing communities, but there are ways to work with that we'll cover in a little bit. But again, starting off fresh with new land development, this is a very effective tool. So another approach that could work for both developing communities, developed and developing, is to modify the impervious surface definition that you use. So one of the ideas here is to replace the word impervious with hard surface. The word impervious implies to a lot of people that if you use something like permeable pavement, you can meet the 25% limit because permeable is not impervious. So these engineered solutions, while very helpful in some situations, are not very desirable in the shoreland environment, and especially in nearshore areas. The shoreland impervious surface standards were designed in 1989, way before the idea of permeable pavement existed. But one of the points was, in addition to reducing surface water runoff, but it's also to preserve green space for vegetation and habitat, and also to help maintain scenic character. So these standards are much more, they're about much more than just stormwater management. So working with the idea of hard surface instead of impervious can help move people in the right direction in terms of thinking about what it is we're trying to do here. It's trying to minimize hard surface, not necessarily impervious surface. But in this case here, the city of Otter Tail has actually gone to the point where they have placed permeable pavers into their definition, and they say that permeable pavers are, in this case, impervious surface in terms of meeting the 25% standard. And so just an idea, this is certainly one way of working with existing development to try to put a cap on the amount of impervious surface or hard surface that people can build. One very targeted action would be to prohibit stormwater facilities on or near bluffs. In recent years, we've seen some very intense rain events. Now this year it's a dry year, but in years when there's more general precipitation and then you have a heavy intense event, you can really have a lot of water in the soils that are very heavy. And if you have stormwater facilities in these areas, they contribute to saturated soils and the risk of bluff or soil failure in steep slope areas. And so it's a good idea to understand more about your soils and think about where you can have infiltration facilities or retention ponds, and perhaps in some areas they shouldn't be allowed, especially if they're going to contribute to bluff erosion or failure. So this is probably something to think about with your engineering staff to understand what the soil conditions are like in different parts of your community, and if nothing else, require some maybe conditional use considerations for placing these facilities in or around steep slope or bluff areas. Moving into a different direction, thinking about ice ridges or berms, these are natural. In many parts of the state, they're pretty common. They're caused by expanding ice, which pushes soil around, or during the spring when you start having ice breakup and strong winds pushing ice against the shore. So, you can have these sorts of things that are regularly occurring. And, there's a lot of reasons to keep them because, ice ridges are bound to show up again. And so you could just live with them and let vegetation get established on them. And that will sort of serve to keep them in place and sort of protect them maybe as they are, rather than having them grow even bigger over time. But these berms can also serve as a barrier to sheet flow and nutrient-laden water running off into your water bodies. So there are some valuable reasons for keeping them. I understand why people might want to remove them. So some communities allow them to be removed, but they require speedy action. So, if you have an ice ridge, for example, Cass County requires that you take care of it by July 1st before vegetation gets established. So a variety of communities have time limits on when these things can be removed. And they also require, in some cases, conditional use permits because the grading of these things can occur in and around the water. And so it's important that there are certain best management practices in place to protect alteration in the lake bed when you're doing this activity. In some cases, you may even need a DNR permit if it's a very extensive regrading project. So the idea is that if you're going to do this, you do it shortly after it occurs while the problem is still relatively small. Okay, another idea here has to do with beaches, and that is to prohibit or limit the use of sand blankets or beaches. So in Hubbard County, they don't allow new beaches. Existing beaches are treated as a non-conforming use, so they can be maintained, but they can't be expanded. So there are limits on top dressing that can occur periodically. Hubbard County treats these as a recreation area, and so every lot or resort can have one recreation area, and the width and depth of these depends based on the lake classification. So we're seeing more and more local governments looking at ways to regulate these things. In the past, they've sort of been a free-for-all, but over time, people are learning that sand blankets don't really work in a lot of places in the state. They really only work that on lakes that are naturally sandy and on shorelines that are relatively flat. And even then, they erode and disappear eventually and need a lot of maintenance. And so there's definitely growing support for regulating, whether these can occur and if they can, the frequency of maintenance and how big they can be. Riprap, big topic. It's a huge challenge for us, and a lot of local governments see it that way as well. Riprap often seems to be a property owner's first and only solution to erosion issues, or simply just as an aesthetic preference. But installing riprap requires clearing a lot of vegetation above and sometimes below the water. And not only does it remove natural vegetation and its water quality benefits, it also removes lots of habitat and blocks passage for amphibians and makes life difficult for waterfowl as well. Now, the shoreline rules do have specific requirements for riprap, and the DNR public water rules have some specific standards for riprap as well. The key one is that riprap is only allowed when there's a demonstrated erosion problem. And riprap is not allowed for aesthetic reasons. And in this case, boulder walls are not considered riprap. I'm sorry, I'm talking about Beltrami and Cass County here. So to offset a lot of these impacts, counties are starting to adopt stricter standards on when and how they can be installed, and in some cases, even requiring a vegetation buffer on the landward side of riprap, as shown here. In many cases, the vegetation designs that are required, or the vegetation that's required behind these things are designed by the local soil and water conservation district. So there's an opportunity here to talk to locals about if they want to put in riprap, why is it? Do they really have an erosion problem? Maybe requiring some sort of evidence of that or a site visit to document. And a lot of counties are taking action like that. Carleton County has a very strong program in investigating and looking at and justifying whether riprap's needed. And if so, there are strong standards for how it's designed and how you integrate vegetation into the design. Anyway, it's an important issue. Riprap is definitely needed in a lot of places, but it's also used pretty excessively in a lot of situations. It's almost become a design aesthetic, or certainly boulder walls have. And so this is one way to sort of back down on that and try to retain a more natural landscape, and only use it when it truly is needed. Retaining walls are similar in their impact. Retaining walls or boulder walls are increasingly popular. Again, installation of these has huge impacts on slopes and vegetation. You obviously need to regrade significantly and remove vegetation to install these features. Most of the time, retaining walls are driven by aesthetics or to create more functional yard space. Certainly understandable. Oftentimes it's not really needed to stabilize slopes. And when you're in a shoreland environment, this is a special place. Natural vegetation, natural habitat is an important part of the ecology of the area and sort of the character. And so unless you really need a wall to stabilize, a lot of communities are putting measures in place to regulate where these can go and how big they can become. And so one example is LeSueur County. They have a variety of permitting categories. And by the way, a lot of counties have approaches like this, where you can have, as a permitted use, a fairly small retaining wall in both height and length, and on smaller slopes, done as an administrative permit. When you start getting bigger walls, certainly within the shore impact zone, that becomes a conditional use. There's more scrutiny over that. There's a public hearing, of course. In both cases, the county requires vegetative screening of the wall, clarification in their standards that boulder walls are not retaining walls. And so it tries to remove the idea of putting in a boulder wall for aesthetic reasons. So some ideas here. Stearns County has some similar standards like this. And if you check out our innovative website, you'll see some other examples as well. All right, next category here has to do with vegetation. And, granted, this is one of the most difficult areas of all to manage. There's just thousands of miles of shoreland in the state. And even though the shoreline rules prohibit intensive clearing in the shore impact zone or the bluff impact zone, it's very difficult to monitor. We get that. And, the standards, while they do allow limited clearing for a wide variety of purposes, again, there's really no quantifiable standards associated with that. And again, no permits are required. And because there's so many miles of shoreline, it's very difficult to manage even selective cutting. But there's some hope. Some communities, such as Itasca County, have developed quantifiable standards to guide removal and restoration. The county, in this case, requires that a buffer exist, which is something more than just a prohibition on cutting. There's a requirement that a buffer actually exists, and the width of that buffer varies depending on the lake classification. These provisions require an evaluation of, the buffer during permitting processes. And if a buffer doesn't exist, one would need to be restored, and we'll cover that in another slide. There are always exceptions for required buffers for recreation areas or for access. So, but the idea is to ensure that the shoreline is protected by a buffer width of some amount, and working with the existing lake classification structure makes a lot of sense. So again, if you have a standard like Itasca does for requiring a buffer, then if there is no buffer when you come in for some sort of permit, could be some sort of expansion of a non-conforming structure or a variance, for impervious surface or some other type of conditional use permit, there's an opportunity to look at the quality and status of a buffer. And if it doesn't meet the standards, then you can have a requirement as part of your condition of permit of approval to restore the buffer to its required dimensions and quality. Now, again, this is something that certainly requires a fair amount of staff capacity and time, and so you would want to make sure that you have that ability if you put these sorts of things into your ordinance. And that's really where the proof is in the pudding. Is a community willing to invest in staff resources to implement these sort of standards? Sort of continuing on the idea of quantifiable standards. There's a lot of language in the Shoreland rules about screening structures, but in the case of Itasca and Hubbard, they're very clear about what that means. So here, at least 50% of the structures, must be screened during leaf-on conditions. If you're going to selectively remove vegetation so that you have a view to the lake from your home, in these cases, they've defined what that is. In this case, a view corridor is something that's less than 50 feet or a third of the parcel width, whichever is less. So again, there's some quantifiable standard to work with when you're permitting this sort of activity. That always makes administration easier and leaves less discretion to the administrator. And I think in most situations where there's potential conflict with a property owner, I think most administrators would prefer to have something specific in the ordinance to work with rather than something that's left to their judgment. So the last category for today, before we wrap up, is to talk about some administrative standards that would hopefully make your job easier. Well, I'm not sure if this first one really does make your job easier, but the idea here is using robust standards or requirements for application submittal. And this example from Stearns County is a very robust approach to reviewing submittal information for staff review for what they call minor shoreline permitting alterations. And so these minor permits cover things like excavation, sand blankets, impervious surface, retaining walls, and riprap. And the county uses a worksheet that staff complete during a pre-application site visit to evaluate whether the requested alteration work is allowed and what type of requirements would be applied to complete that work. And so there's a scoring system, and that's used to determine some of the standards or conditions that might be used. Crow Wing County has something similar to this. Aitkin County, I believe, does too. There's a lot of really good ideas out there to really help provide transparency and clarity about what is the standard and what kind of required conditions are required, to go through with the permitting approval. Another idea, kind of a simple one, but Sherburne County won't issue a permit or any other approval for a property in which there is an outstanding violation. I think a lot of communities have something like this. It's not as clear as how Sherburne County operates this, but it also requires certainly a good tracking and monitoring procedure. In a similar vein, in hopes of getting better compliance, is to make non-compliance expensive. And Le County requires that unpermitted projects, when they're discovered, to complete an application within a very specific time frame and to pay higher fees to have the project reviewed. If the unpermitted project violates the code, the property owner must either apply for an after-the-fact variance, again with higher fees, and to restore the site to compliance with the ordinance. So, again, this is very transparent. It's, you can put the word out that, if you're caught, there will be some consequences, and, that might encourage more people to apply for a project up front, as you would hope they would. Another administrative technique that definitely takes some work through the flexibility provisions of the Shoreland Ordinance is to, allow the expansion of non-conforming structures. The Shoreland rules don't allow that other than through a variance, but we have learned that some communities actually get better results for variances through an administrative permit. So, but there are some limits to that. Allowing expansion of structures not meeting the ordinary high setback is a common variance, but it could be an allowable administrative permit if there are conditions such that the structure is not in the shore impact zone, the impervious surface standards are met, and there's some restoration of a riparian buffer. So, this is an approach we worked on with City of Victoria to allow them to do this as an administrative permit as long as these conditions were part of that approval process. And you can see that, these are pretty good standards, probably not something that would happen commonly through a variance process in a Board of Adjustment decision. So if you feel like your boards of adjustments are giving a lot of variances without a lot of good conditions to protect shoreline, talk to us about doing something like this, and we'll see what we can work out. And then really the last thing here I wanted to talk about is just the idea of nonconformities. You probably noticed that there are state statutes protecting nonconformities and they use a lot of these terms. And these aren't defined very well. And this is one of the most common areas of difficulty in approving whether somebody can expand a nonconformity or if it even is a nonconformity. And that's because the terminology in this area is very, very vague. And so if you find yourselves in some conflict with property owners, maybe it would be useful to take some time to work with your planning commission to clarify what these terms mean and put them in your definitions section. And so the structure on the screen, what is this? Is this an existing nonconformity? Is it something that can expand? It's hard to know sometimes, depending on how your ordinance currently addresses these things. But I think it's just good insurance to be clear about what all these things mean and how they apply to your community's vision of nonconformities. And then just the very last higher standard is to let you know that under Minnesota statutes 86B, local governments can take on surface water regulations, if there are concerns about wakes, speeds, number of mooring spaces, or other issues occurring out on the water that are affecting your quality of life on the land. You certainly have the ability to do that. Not a lot of communities do this, but there are certain parts of the state that have done that, especially areas that are highly developed with a lot of boat traffic. And so that's really what we have today. And if you have any questions or any more things that you'd like to discuss, let us know or put them in the chat. We'll be happy to answer them for you. Take care, everyone. And
thanks, everybody.
Talk later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.